Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you on this, the 27th day of January in the year 2014. It is a Monday. Right now here in Appalachia, the sun is shining, and we are in the throes of quite a drop in temperature. This morning at 6:30, it was 41 degrees here in Beckley. Last time I looked, which was about an hour and a half ago, it was 23 here in Beckley. And the predictions are that we'll be down to something in the area of 3 to 5 below this evening. Tomorrow, the high temperature is supposed to be 9 degrees. And then tomorrow night, 6 to 8 below zero. So here we go again. You know, the irony of this is that as you go through it each time, it becomes a little bit less daunting than it was the first time. I think a lot of people were really scared the first time. And now with this one coming, maybe it's the fact that the prediction is that we're going to finally break out of this at the end of this week, beginning on Thursday. But we'll see. I know that this is one of those huge cold snaps, the jet stream going all the way down into Texas and Florida, and so the entire eastern part of the United States is experiencing this. So this is one incredible January. I was thinking as we were waiting to go on the air here that it was less than a month ago, as we approached the end of 2013, that I was hearing more than one person say, boy, I'm glad 2013's over. I can't wait to start a new year. This year, for whatever reason, whether they be personal or not, has been terrible. Well, I'm feeling the same way about the month of January, and the 1st of February is Sunday, is this coming Sunday, and I can't wait. This, in many ways, may be the longest month I've ever experienced in my life, and I know other people agree with me as well. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I don't know that you need that particular weather forecast. You can get them everywhere. But I am excited because it is Monday, and we are going to spend a couple of hours together here at the Virtual Center, and I look forward to it each and every single time. We would love to hear from you. I want to touch on a few things related to our programs last week before we get into something a little bit different today, but I think it's a logical extension of what we've been talking about. So anyway, with that, let me make sure that you have the phone number, and let me encourage you to pick up the phone and call us and share your ideas and your thinking on some of these issues. Received an email, a couple of emails, in fact. One of them will be in the topic today. I'd like to spend at least time today and probably tomorrow in looking at the Common Core standards in education, what's happening and the concerns about them. It's creating more and more noise, if you will, among both on both the right and the left. So I think the issue is well worth some attention. And one of the emails one of the emailers alerted me to a piece which I printed off, and it'll be a part of our program here on the Common Core. The other email I received is from Scott in Sweden. And he was making reference to the programs last week about the private sector collection of personal information of customers and people generally, and basically made the point that this is one that really is very, very serious and warrants the attention that we've been giving it. We gave it our full attention last week during all three programs. That's 6 hours, and I think we began it in a program the previous week. So we've done, I think, noble service in addressing that issue. We're not done. I have a couple of articles here. I'm not gonna stretch it out anymore, but I know some of you have heard about and are interested in the whole idea of what is called artificial intelligence, which is kind of the extension of this. I mean, this is the newest version of science fiction, which is the idea of computers replacing human beings in terms of the ability to think cognitively and do analysis and to compile and assess and synthesize data and all the rest of it. So I think the issue of artificial intelligence fits very, very well into this. Also, I looked at an email in the Washington Post about a week, 10 days ago, dealing with smartphones and some research that's been done which indicates that so few people proportionally are taking advantage of what smartphones are able to do. And of course, it's a throwback to the idea of computers themselves. Much of the data over the last several years suggests that for most of us who own computers, work on computers, kind of live on computers in a lot of ways, we're probably only using 10 to 15% of the capability of the technology. And it kind of suggests that there's a small group of people that is maximizing the technology and the use of the technology and the implications for what it can do. And they're the ones that we've been talking about that perhaps are making the innovations in technology which are causing change faster and faster. And for the decrease at such a rate that very, very is the fact that so few of us, even now, are able to take advantage of the capability of the very technology that we use all the time. Anyway, our phone number, I want to try to make it a point to repeat it a couple of times during today's program. Area code 304-658-33-658. If you'd like to communicate your ideas and your thoughts on some of these subjects directly to me, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word. O'Brien is I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. Already made a few references to the idea of artificial intelligence and a number of other things that happening. I think we last time and unemployment and the extent to which the information communication revolution that we find ourselves in and the technology that's driving it seems to be rendering more and more of our population unemployable, not just unemployed, but unemployable. Because whereas, and I know we've talked about this before, and I think it's just good to kind of bring it to the surface and remind us of this. The article we looked at that addressed the issue of the differences between the so-called made the point that what makes this so-called first industrial revolution, the industrial revolution itself, was that while there is all sorts of evidence of what the economists call creative destruction, the idea was resulting in the fact that a number of jobs were being eliminated as think cognitively and control the power, the technological power that was being developed. So in a sense, as creative destruction was happening, as jobs were being eliminated, new jobs were being created. And so the result was that unemployment didn't necessarily mean anything like, except for the very few, unemployable, because for the most part, new jobs that were being created by the very forces that were eliminating the old jobs. Is that because of the technological change, the degree of change, and the compounding of the degree, and I think one of the authors we looked at made the point that the difference is that when we talk about change now, we're not talking about change piling on top of what was in order to create something new. We're talking about change happening at an accelerating rate to the point that we're experiencing what some people would call revolution every couple of years. The degree of change is so great. The result is that the pressure on people, on human beings, to keep up with that in order to remain employable becomes less and less likely, more and more impossible. Consequently, it seems, and this is really, I think, the heart of what we were talking about, is that many people are finding when the jobs that they have been doing are eliminated by technology, the fact of the matter is that the technology is creating demands for new skills that fewer and fewer of our people have. And consequently, the likelihood of these people getting jobs equal to or even better than the jobs that they have lost is becoming less and less likely. So it seems to me this is one of the things that we really need to do. I've been playing with the computer here, and I got myself into a little bit of a bind, but I'll be okay. The result is, or the problem is, that we are creating a situation which is making it more and more likely that fewer and fewer of us are going to be able to keep up. The technology is changing and moving forward so rapidly. The result is that, as we concluded last week, much of the inequality that is happening, of course the focus has been on the United States, but inequality in the West generally has become more and more pronounced, as fewer and fewer people are doing better and better, while more and more people are doing worse and worse. And the result is that the inequality that everyone is talking about is being exacerbated, is being enhanced by what's happening in the realm of technology. So consequently, I think we are confronted with a problem. And one of the things that we looked at in one of the pieces last week that we addressed was the issue of upgrading our education system. I think Tom Friedman suggested this in the conclusion of his column about it will take a hammer, I'd take a hammer, is streamlining and upgrading our education system in order to have a better chance of providing the kinds of skills that people need and will need in order to remain employable. And that leads logically into the pressures that are underway right now to upgrade and reform specifically what is being referred to as the application or the introduction of so-called Common Core standards in each state. At this point, 46 states have bought into the so-called Common Core standards, as well as Washington, D.C. So the fact of the matter is, almost overnight, relatively speaking, not in a matter of years, but in a matter of months, the Common Core standards have kind of, because the implication is that these standards are the kinds of things that are going to revise to the collection of personal information and data, and the idea of networking, and not only in the hands of private collectors, the private sector, but also in the hands of government in the form of the NSA. In the last program we did, we closed with an article which looked at the whole issue of fear and the extent to which it is causing people to surrender information and privacy to government as never before, and what the long-range implications of that might be. So I think the transition into what we call the Common Core standards is pretty much in line with where we've been going and what we've been doing. It seems to be called for. It seems to be long called for. What I am planning to do is not only deal with the perspectives on the Common Core standards, why some people advocate, why so many people initially supported them or seem to, and why so many people now are coming into the forefront as opponents of these standards. And it's not just conservatives. It's voices from the right and the left. And so consequently, from both sides, the Common Core standards are getting a lot of attention, a lot of conversation, and a lot of time in the media. What I would like to do is not only look at the concerns and the issues and the assumptions of people on both sides of the aisle in terms of looking at the Common Core standards, but I'd actually like to look at the standards themselves. Nobody does this, it seems to me, or very few do. They talk about the standards, but nobody actually looks at the standards themselves and what they say. So I have taken the liberty of going online and printing off some of the standards in English and, of course, in history, because that's where I live. I was going to print off some of the standards in math as well, but I would very honestly, I wouldn't be able to take that one too far. But because right now the focus has been on reading and writing and on math and science, but gradually the disciplines, including history, are falling into line and will be moving into the sights, if you will, the crosshairs of the Common Core standards. So I've got copies of them, and I just want to kind of share some of the issues with you and encourage your input and your reactions, your ideas, your suggestions, your concerns, because I think this affects all of us, not only us as people, but our children, our grandchildren, the next generation, the economy, what happens, what's likely to happen in the economy, all of it. I think this is so important. And again, in a republic, and we've spent a lot of time addressing or establishing the foundation of the fact that we do indeed, our founders did indeed give us a republic, as Benjamin Franklin warned, if you can keep it. And I think we're into something here which suggests that if there's a threat to the republic in a lot of ways, this might be it. This whole issue of technology and the demise of individual citizen privacy and what the implication of this is in the future for both government and for the private sector and our education system and people's employability and people's hopes about the future in terms of careers and all the rest of it. I think this is so incredibly important to what the Virtual Center is all about that I think our best strategy is to get into it. And what I'd like to do is share with you an email, and this is not about the Common Core. This is kind of a wrap-up of last week, but I couldn't pass and let this program begin without sharing you and giving credit to the person who wrote me this particular email. And when I got it, I answered and told the writer that I would be using this on today's program, and I just want to do that because I think it's an incredible example and illustration of many of the things we were talking about. The author of this email I'm going to identify because many of you will know who I'm talking about. The author of this email is Keith Lilly, who is a historian and one of my not only colleagues but closest friends. And many of you will know that for years Keith Lilly has been my associate in administering 2 Department of Education grants in American history. The first one was written in 2002, the second one in 2009. And if it hadn't been for Keith, I don't know whether I would have been able to get through him, and I owe him more than I'll live long enough to repay, very honestly. Not only in terms of his knowledge and his skills and his contributions to the programs themselves, but his role as confidant and friend to me and support many times that when I felt that I needed it, I could turn to him and he was there. He's one of the most incredibly bright, creative, perceptive historians that I've known in my entire professional life. And I think we in Southern West Virginia and especially students who are in his classes, and there are a lot of them because he teaches 5 and 6 classes a semester. And because of the fact that he's so god-awful good and interesting, his classes are usually well attended and populated. His classes always fill to the brim, and there's always requests for extra seats and additional admissions. He's popular, and if you talk to students, I've been doing it for years. He's interesting. He makes it interesting. He's a good guy, and he's pretty demanding. But on the other hand, you learn something when you sit through his class. I mean, what more can anybody say about an instructor than that? Anyway, Keith informed me, of course, part of this was the fact that because of the weather situation last week, our schools weren't meeting, and so much of his teaching was not underway. And consequently, he sent me an email Friday and said, "I've been listening the last couple of days on your program." And of course, I was flattered, to be honest with you. I didn't think of him listening because I assumed that he had so many other things that he was doing. But because of the weather, many of those things were on hold. And this is what he said, and I'm going to just share this with you because the information is, I think, so apropos, so appropriate for what we were talking about last week. "The fear of internal security, as you well know," he says, "makes so much sense in historical contexts. Madison and the framers were well aware of the restraints and internal security, such as censorship of the press." I'm not going to go into a long tangential discussion here of that, but those of you who are familiar with American history will know that during Washington's administration in the early 1790s, when the split between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonian Federalists was occurring, the media was intricately involved in this, and consequently each side, the Jeffersonians and the Federalists, employed newspaper editors and newspapers whose principal job was to mouth the point of view of that particular group, that particular party. You had Republican newspapers that were attacking the Federalists, and you had Federalist newspapers that were attacking the Jeffersonian Republicans. And as we know in the history of the 1790s, when Washington retires in 1796 and hands the reins over to John Adams, who's elected in 96 and becomes president up until 1800 when Jefferson is elected president of the United States, one of the more insidious aspects of the Adams administration is the passage of the so-called Alien and Sedition Acts, which is censorship of the press and limits on freedom of speech. It is entirely political. The goals were political. It was done in the name of protecting the security of the nation, but it was very obvious that Federalists were implementing these laws principally to silence the Republican opposition and hopefully to eliminate, to reverse and then ultimately eliminate the growth of Jeffersonian republicanism in America. So there's no question that the framers were well aware of the issue of restraints and the idea of internal security when it came to things like freedom of the press, censorship of the press. And that's what Keith is talking about. Let me go back to his email. They existed, the issue of censorship and restraints and concerns about internal security and all the rest of it. They existed in the limited constitutional monarchy that was Britain. However, in absolutist France, the collection of information and use of it to maintain order was even more profound. In his recently released second volume on Napoleon entitled Citizen Emperor, Philip Dwyer writes extensively on how Napoleon used the police state, censorship, and even propaganda in the form of newspapers and art to create an image of his state and its ruler, as well as attempt to quell opposition to it. It was especially difficult for him because of the French Revolution's heritage in because of the Revolution's heritage in republicanism, which Napoleon had to pay at least lip service to in official press and artistic outputs. In other words, part of Napoleon's image and popularity was the idea that he was mouthing the priorities of Republican government and the rights of citizens and all the rest of it. That was the basis of its strength. So as Keith points out, while he is an emperor in charge of a nation and looking for power and using the power of the police state and censorship and propaganda and all the rest of it, he's forced to pay lip service to the elements of republicanism. Reports poured in from all over the empire, and France in particular, telling the emperor how others were viewing him. He and his police minister, Joseph Fouché, also sought to cut off any political opposition by any means possible. For Dwyer, this is one of the reasons that Napoleon was a resurrection of the main ideas of absolutism, which translates into the idea of unlimited government, with a veneer of liberalism. So Napoleon was straddling the fence, the ideological fence, if you were. He was managing a state which was moving rapidly towards the idea of absolute power in the hands of government, at the same time that he was mouthing the elements of republicanism and the philosophy of liberalism. I am sure, Keith Lilly says, you are quite aware of how many American observers, John Quincy Adams in particular, saw these developments. The one thing that, of course, greatly limited Napoleon and even later Hitler was the lack of technology by comparison to the world of the 21st century. Republics always struggle with a tension between the need to maintain order but not encroach on the freedom of its citizens. Technology complicates that beyond belief, and in ways that Madison or Napoleon could never have conceived. Just a few aimless thoughts, Keith Lilly says in closing. I would suggest to you they are hardly aimless. They are very, very significant and very, very real, and I think they add a lot to what we were talking about in our last program about the use of fear in order to garner power in the police state, in order to get people to support the need for a police state and the censorship of information and the censorship of the press and limitations on free speech and all the rest of it. All of that is driven by the very, very shrewd political use of fear. The idea that the state is in danger, that there is a threat out there which is so huge that we are forced, in order to fulfill our constitutional responsibilities to protect the nation, we are forced to adopt these extreme measures. I know that a number of you have been, at some point in your career, whether it was while you were in school or after you left it, have probably read George Orwell's Animal Farm, about the takeover of the farm by the animals and the extent to which the pigs are able to use fear, the threat of outside agitation and attack, in order to solidify their power over the farm and more power in their own hands. It is a classic illustration of the use of fear in order to secure power, in order to get people to go along with the need for government power in order to protect security. And that's what Keith Lilly is pointing out occurred in Napoleon's France as well. He continues to mouth the ingredients and the priorities of republicanism, the idea of freedoms of speech and press and assembly and all the rest of it, the idea of political accountability of those who govern to those who elect them to govern. But the fact of the matter is, in many cases, it's just that, lip service. I think this adds incredibly to the points that we were trying to address in our last program. I want to thank Keith. My guess is he's not listening today because I know he has classes. Seems like he has in class all the time. I don't know how he does it, but he does. And but the fact of the matter is, I appreciate him listening to the virtual center in the first place, but I also appreciate this contribution. It's very, very healthy and very, very much appreciated. The Common Core standards. A number of emails from listeners in previous months have made reference to these standards. I've made reference to these standards more than once in talking about education and the need for reform in education and all the rest of it. One of the pieces of literature that I came into possession with, I'm sorry, I was turning around looking for a piece of paper and I inadvertently got away from the microphone, so my voice probably tailed off there, and I apologize. On the 15th of January, which was a week ago last Wednesday, in the Washington Post, one of the regular writers for the Washington Post, who's, I guess you could say, without danger of being inaccurate, he's kind of the op-ed conservative at the Washington Post, and that's, of course, George Will. And I think everybody knows George Will. He's been around for years. He's very, very consistent, very, very articulate. A lot of people can't stand him. A lot of people like him. But it seems to me that you kind of have to be aware of what George Will is saying. He's a regular op-ed writer, a good one. He's written a number of pieces on key issues. And basically, the piece that he wrote on the 15th of January, he entitled "Doubts Over the Common Core." And he raised serious questions. And, of course, this comes from the conservative base that he's principally in tune with. And he makes the point, and this, I think, kind of sets the stage for what we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. He said, if you're in Washington and you look at the whole situation within Washington, oftentimes Washington, he says, is the last place to learn about important developments. In other words, things are happening all over the world, and a lot of times Washington is the last to know. And he said, if you are looking at it from the perspective of Washington, D.C., opposition to the Common Core standards seems rather small. He makes reference to it as the biblical cloud that ariseth out of the sea. It's no larger than a man's hand. In other words, only now is opposition to the Common Core standards becoming visible in Washington. But he predicts, soon, however, this education policy will fill a significant portion of the political sky. He's making a point that the controversy and debate about the Common Core standards is going to be with us for a long time. It's going to become much more visible, much more heated, and much more impossible to ignore. And then he goes on in this article to raise questions about the Common Core. His major concern, and I have to say this, I'm interpreting his article. I will read what he says. But I have concluded, after reading this article 2 or 3 times, that George Will's principal concern is not the Common Core. It's the power that seems to be flowing to the federal government as a result of the Common Core. In other words, George Will is an insightful columnist. He's no stranger to research. But he's also a political voice of the right. And I would suggest that sometimes one of the most difficult things for political ideologues, people who are driven by strong concerns on one side or the other of the political spectrum, have difficulty separating ends and means. In other words, they tend to see issues from the perspective of the big campaign that they are worried about, which is the power flowing to government. And as you read this article, as I read this article, I see these political concerns as being George Will's priority concerns. I think he looks at the Common Core standards and the debate over them only as additional evidence to the danger that he sees of the flow of decision-making power toward the nation's capital and toward the people who man the federal agencies there. Not only the White House, but the Department of Education and the rest of it. I think the reason I say this is not necessarily to create a negative impression of George Will, because I think what George Will is saying in this particular piece is very significant. We need to know it. But I also think it's important to understand that George Will has an agenda. And his inclination is to reduce the issues which seem to be the focus of his attention to that agenda. He never veers too far from the agenda and the priorities of the agenda. Consequently, the issues never become the ends to George Will. They always somehow find their way into the category of means to the agenda that George Will believes is the real end of all of this. I think it's very important to recognize that. So let me, with that, interpretation, let me read the second paragraph of George Will's piece, and I think you'll begin to get the idea of where I got that. To quote George Will, "The Common Core represents the ideas of several national organizations, of governors and school officials, about what and how children should learn. It is the thin end of an enormous wedge. It is designed to advance in primary and secondary education the general progressive agenda of centralization and uniformity." And those last 5 or 6 words I underlined. What he sees the Common Core as being about is yet another example of a progressive strategy to advance both in primary education and secondary education the progressive agenda of centralization of power and decision-making and uniformity, greater uniformity over our education system. And I would suggest to you that's where my comments came from. I see that as his principal concern. Understandably, he says, proponents of the Common Core want its nature and purpose to remain as cloudy as possible for as long as possible. Again, he's writing from a very distinct, identifiable political perspective. He is basically suggesting that the advocates of the Common Core standards are going out of their way to make the nature and purpose of the reform, so-called, as cloudy as possible for as long as possible. The longer they can keep the whole agenda fuzzy and muddy, so that people aren't really sure what's going on and don't really know what's going on, it works to their political advantage. That's basically his argument in the first sentence of his very next paragraph. Hence, they say it is a state-led voluntary initiative to merely guide education with standards that are neither written nor approved nor mandated by Washington, which would never ever prescribe a national curriculum. I'm going to give you some information that he provides, which will point out that there is law on the books which deny the federal government the right to dictate a national curriculum. But his approach here is to make it very clear that the proponents of Common Core standards are doing as much as they can to make their efforts come as close to the imposition of national standards as they can possibly accomplish without breaking the law. And the tongue-in-cheek sarcasm, because these advocates of the Common Core claim that it's state-led, voluntary, and its purpose is to merely guide education with standards that aren't written and have not been approved or mandated by Washington. And then he sarcastically says, which would never, ever prescribe a national curriculum. Proponents of the Common Core talk warily when describing it, because a candid characterization would reveal yet another Obama administration indifference to legality. There's further evidence of the interpretation that I put forth at the very beginning before we got into this piece. His major goal is to pin what he sees as the negatives of the Common Core on the Obama administration. I don't think he ever veers from that agenda. To him, the Common Core is not a reform movement that deserves attention. The Common Core is most importantly to him the latest effort of progressives to move decision-making to Washington and to create more uniformity throughout the country through the adherence to these national standards. I have to say that George Will is not totally wrong here. As we will see, the administration in Washington has gone to great lengths to almost force states to go along with these standards, and then to turn around and suggest that the standards come from the states themselves, not from the federal government. In other words, this is not a top-down reform movement in education driven by Washington. Rather, it's a bottom-up reform movement whose ingredients are being dictated by the people who will live with the standards, not those in Washington who will evaluate their success. There's absolutely no question that much of what George Will is implying here is true. There's no question that the sarcasm that he clearly expresses when he says Washington, which would never, ever prescribe a national curriculum, he's not totally wrong, because there's absolutely no question that the administration has done everything that it can do through the Department of Education and the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, to coerce states into adopting these standards. But we'll see more of that as we go on. Now what George Will does is give us some insight into the legislation which limits the ability of Washington to mandate curriculum. In other words, his is evidence as to why Washington cannot dictate a national curriculum. And this is, I'm just reading from his piece. The 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, 1965. The original federal intrusion into the state and local responsibility. So in other words, the mere passage of federal legislation in 1965 entitled the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, George Will is suggesting is the first real intrusion into local and state control over education by the federal government in Washington. But he points out, and this is a quote, "Nothing in this act shall authorize any federal official to mandate, direct, or control schools' curriculums." So the 1965 legislation, which obviously included and addressed a number of specific objectives and goals and standards that Washington would look for in education. The legislation passed by Congress and signed by the President in 1965, this would be Lyndon Johnson, made it very clear that nothing in the act was turning curriculum over to the federal government. That's written there in black and white. George Will basically paraphrases that legislation and makes that point. Then he goes on and says in 1970, the General Education Provisions Act of 1970 stipulates, quote, "No provision of any applicable program shall be construed to authorize any federal agency or official to exercise any direction, supervision, or control over the curriculum, program of instruction, or selection of instructional materials by any school system." So what is spelled out in 65 is reinforced in either stronger terms 5 years later in 1970. Nothing in the General Education Provisions Act allows the federal government or any federal government the right to exercise any direction, any supervision, or any control over curriculum, programs of instruction, or the selection of instructional materials by any school system. In other words, what happens in the classroom remains a local state issue. A local school system, local school board, parents, local businesses, this is a community issue as to what happens day to day in the local schools. But what Washington is doing in these pieces of legislation is creating kind of a national umbrella within which all of these details ought to fit, ought to fall. And then finally he points out that in 1979, the law that created the department, the National Education Department, the NED, made it very clear that the Education Department was not allowed to exercise any direction, supervision, or control over the curriculum or program of instruction of any school system. it says that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, as amended, says that no education department funds, Federal Department of Education from Washington, may be used to endorse, approve, or sanction any curriculum designed to be used in grades K through 12. So what George Will has done is cite the legislation from 65, 70, and the legislation which created the Department of Education in Washington in 1979, and emphasize that in all three pieces of legislation, careful attention by Congress was given to the idea that in no way did any of this federal legislation suggest a takeover of local education by Washington. Nevertheless, Will says, what begins with mere national standards must breed ineluctable pressure to standardize content. In other words, once you have national standards, and once you are going to hold local school systems accountable on whether in fact students meet those standards, then in effect you are moving toward the standardization of curriculum, even though the law says you can't. And George Will is exactly right. There's absolutely no question. Targets, metrics, guidelines, curriculum models, all induce conformity to instructional materials. If your school is going to look good, if your students are going to perform competitively and admirably, then you got to make sure that the curriculum you adopt and the materials you use in your classrooms, what you ask your teachers to do, is going to prepare your students to be able to demonstrate the accountability of your educational system to these national standards. So by inference, by indirection, you aren't standardizing curriculum from Washington, but you are laying out what the standards will be, what the measures of success and or failure will be. And then you're holding school systems accountable toward meeting those. And the way you determine whether in fact that's happening or not is by testing kids. And the more accountable you want local school systems to become, the more tests you have to administer. And the result is what we hear teachers and teachers organizations like the National Endowment, the National Education Association, and the National Federation of Teachers, and all of these other groups arguing that our teachers have pretty much become instructors who find themselves teaching to the tests rather than educating children. Because proving the accountability has become more of a priority than the kids in your classroom. Now, George Will doesn't say any of this. This is me talking. But the fact of the matter is, this whole process reduces kids from ends to means. Instead of the purpose of what's happening in our classrooms being the education of our children, instead the priority has shifted into testing our children in order to prove that our education system is accountable to the more and more precise, definitive standards under which we must operate. Washington, George Will says, already is encouraging the alignment of the GED tests, SATs, and ACTs, college admission tests, with the Common Core. By a feedback loop, these tests will beget more curriculum conformity. All of this will take a toll on parental empowerment, and none of this will escape the politicization of learning like that already rampant in higher education. I won't get into the politics of higher education. That's another issue. But he's using that merely as an example. And what he's suggesting is that more and more the ACT tests and the SAT tests, which juniors and seniors take in order to be admitted to college, more and more what's on these tests is being driven by these Common Core standards. Therefore, in order to adequately prepare your youngsters to be successful in these college admission tests, you got to teach to the standards. And so you haven't done anything legislatively to mandate control over curriculum, but you've made it almost impossible for teachers to do anything else except restructure what they do in the classroom to allow students to be successful on the tests and thus demonstrate that you are accountable and are adhering to the standards. So in effect, you've made kind of an end run around the law, but you've accomplished effectively the same thing. George Will continues. Leave aside the abundant, fierce, often learned, and frequently convincing criticisms of the writing, literature, and mathematics standards themselves. Let's leave that aside for a moment. I'm not going to leave that aside. I think we're going to address those. Even satisfactory national standards must extinguish federalism's creativity. At any time, he said, now he's talking something about politics. At any time, it's more likely that there will be a half dozen innovative governors than one creative federal education bureaucracy. And the mistakes made by top-down federal reforms are continental mistakes. What he's basically suggesting is that this top-down imposition of standards, and keep in mind that nobody's imposing standards, what effectively is happening is you're making impossible for local school systems not to teach to the standards. There's quite a bit of difference. It's kind of like the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed after the Civil War, doesn't give anybody the rights to do anything. All it does is establish the penalties to state governments that deny people these rights. In other words, it lays out, the 14th Amendment lays out what's going to happen to southern states after the Civil War if they don't follow the mandates of emancipation of slavery and the 14th Amendment's definition of ex-slaves as citizens. Whenever it's proven that the states are violating the letter of that law, the 14th Amendment lays out the punishments that the states will experience. But again, as the Supreme Court made clear in 1883 when it heard the so-called civil rights cases, the 14th Amendment didn't give anybody the rights to do anything. There's nothing in the 14th Amendment that forbids businesses or individual citizens from discriminating against citizens based on race or anything else. The only thing the 14th Amendment addresses are state governments, and they pay a penalty if they discriminate. And the 14th Amendment lays out what those penalties are, but it doesn't give anybody the right to be treated equally. It just spells out what the penalties will be if you are not treated equally. And what George Will is pointing out here is the same kind of thing. And he's pointing out this is something that's been in American political parlance discussions for a long time. And this is the idea that the tremendous advantages of our federal system which divides power between state governments and federal governments, is that states oftentimes become laboratories. You can try things out on the state level, and if they don't work, you abandon them. But if they do work, then they can be picked up and applied on the national level. You don't get that kind of creativity and that willingness to experiment on the national level to the same degree you do in the state level. And that's why he says that it's much more likely that you're going to get, a number of governors of state governments who are much more creative than you're going to find coming out of any federal bureaucracy in Washington. So basically what he's suggesting is these Common Core standards are running counter to a principle of American government and American politics that we've known for a long time. That because state governments are smaller, they're much more flexible. Their mistakes don't become as big and as expensive as federal mistakes. So consequently, the federal government can learn from what works or doesn't work at the state and local level. And by mandating Common Core standards from Washington, we're essentially running contrary to what we know works. We've gone beyond the top of our hour. It's actually 3 minutes past the top of our hour. So let's pause and take a break for 5 minutes or 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll be back and we'll continue this discussion of the Common Core standards. I invite you to share your ideas and your thinking on this extremely important topic with our listeners by giving us a call. When we come back, I'll give you the phone number once again. This is Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a brief break, we'll be right back. Please stay tuned.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility with your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien. And Dr. Bill, you have Dr. John calling from a car phone.
Thank you, Bob. And John, it's a pleasure to hear from you again.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bill. It's great to hear from you as well. I hope I'm coming in okay.
You sure are. You sound great.
Wonderful. Well, better than I feel. I've been a little under the weather with this most recent cold snap. I hope you're doing okay.
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you. And I'm
great.
loving this time that we do this. I just love this stuff, and this particular topic, with the standards and stuff. I just go crazy over this stuff. I love it, and I think it's so important, and I think people really need to understand what's going on, and that's what's really driving me on this. So it's so great to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I think it's crucially important too. My concern is I feel like there's a bit of a disingenuousness here with this column that Mr. Will is writing, and that is, I think it's very clear to most observers that there are major failings in the very disjointed, dispersed system of standards that are in states right now. That, simply put, students are not comparable in different states, even in different districts.
No, they are not.
I think that right. I mean, you've experienced this. I certainly have.
Sure.
And I'm sure many parents have. So it just seems like we've been going for so long, manifestly refusing to establish major standards, that why is it so problematic to give this a try? I fail to see the reasoning in his argument.
John, I think you've touched on a key issue here, and to be very honest with you, this is where I want to go with this. I really think that, what we have here with George Will is yet another example of an effort to tear down reform or any kind of change without putting anything in its place. And you make the point that there's so much disparity throughout the nation and within states themselves on the quality of education. We fund our local school systems predominantly with property taxes. And so consequently, the schools that are located in the wealthiest communities put the most money into their education systems, and consequently their students tend to do better on any kind of measure of success, any kind of accountability measure at all, they tend to perform. And we've been doing this since the very beginning of our public education system. And so in a sense, if you're attacking change and you don't propose anything in its place, then what you are effectively doing is endorsing what we've got now. And what we've got now, to be very honest with you, is not working.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I teach courses in evolution in college, and I've done it at 4 institutions of various degrees of eliteness, right? And what I find over and over again is a general lack of familiarity with basic concepts of biology that should be covered in high school.
Yes.
But it's interesting that the pattern always holds. It's students who come to my institutions from states that are generally less well off, states of the old Confederacy, and I'm sorry to say that, but it's the case, and students who come from very rural, very low-income backgrounds.
Yes.
Students from New York State, students from large cities, students from private schools, they come in already knowing a good deal of the material that we're going to cover. They know the basics, which allows me to go deeper with them. And this is over and over again consistent. I can only imagine it's the case in other disciplines as well, is that there are almost 2 levels of students who come in having come through these schools where local control is so paramount, right? And there's a bifurcation. Some are ready to go farther, and some need remedial instruction. And to me, that is unconscionable, and it's not going to keep us on top when science and math and flexibility and critical reasoning are so important going forward.
No, and the problem, one of the problems I see with the Common Core is that they are much more demanding standards than anything that exists now. Not only that, but they are national, which makes it possible to compare performance in different areas, in different states and in different regions and socioeconomic backgrounds and all the rest of it. There's absolutely no question that it's going to be a gold mine for those people that are looking for ways to generate meaningful data. There's no question on that. But the fact of the matter is, what we've got right now is working for a few people, but for the vast majority of our youngsters, it's not working. And if you set out to oppose any change at all, then you are, in effect, endorsing a system which is not working for the vast majority of the kids that are forced into it. And that's what, it seems to me, that's the issue that George Will and those who agree with him are going to have to deal with. That ultimately, their concern is not the kids of America. Their concern is to preserve the system which is benefiting a few people at the expense of the majority. And I find that even more unconscionable than what might be wrong with the standards.
Well,
I mean, that's my own
great.
feeling.
No, I think you have suggested that my concerns here are valid. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you continue.
Okay, John.
It's very interesting.
Thank you, my friend. It's wonderful. And listen, you be careful. I know you're on the road.
I will. Thank you, sir.
Okay, be careful. Thank you, John. It's wonderful to hear from John, and his concerns are valid, and that's really going to be my point. That's going to be where I want to take all of this, and John's perceptive enough to see that. But again, we're dealing with a principle here that applies to much more than this issue, and I think it's very, very significant that we're seeing this with health care. That those people that are going out of their way to attack the Affordable Care Act, labeling it Obamacare with all of the sarcasm that's associated with the use of that term as it rolls off people's lips in the most sarcastic way. Very rarely do any of them come up with an alternative. They're more than willing to preserve a system which is denying somewhere between 45 and 50 million Americans health care. Instead, they're endorsing a system which allows the people who can buy the best to get the best, and denying the vast majority of the citizens in this nation access to that same level of health care. And so if you attack what people are proposing without any effort to replace it with something else, then you are endorsing the status quo. And if you happen to be one of those at the top who's doing very well under the status quo, then that makes perfect sense. But if you don't fit there, then it almost seems that any kind of change is going to be preferable to what you got, what you have. And it seems to me that what I wish people were doing instead when it comes to the Common Core is pointing out the problems. And there are a number of problems, there's no question. But come up with ways to fix the problems, recognizing that something needs to happen. Because we are condemning generation after generation of our children to the kind of education that is not going to make it possible for them to succeed in a rapidly changing society. And the issues that we've been dealing with over the last 4 or 5 days related to technology, it seems to me suggest that we're running out of time. That we are in the midst of a situation where more and more of our people are being rendered unemployable by an economy that is being fed by technological advances which are rapidly outstripping the ability of our own people to keep up with them. And the more demanding the skills become, the more unlikely it is that our people will be able to make it. To the point that some of the proposals we were talking about last week are suggesting guaranteed minimum income, guaranteeing everybody at least a living wage and health care and education. In other words, at least they'll make it. That's seriously on the table for many, many people. So I think the issue is a very, very important one. George Will, first of all, let me welcome you back to our second hour. We had John right away, and but I want to welcome you. And if you've been with us through the entire program today, I thank you for staying with us. And if you did join us in the second hour, then you were privileged to listen to John's call and to basically benefit as I did from John's insight. Again, our phone number, and we would love to hear from you, area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, waobrien906@gmail.com. Back to George Will. I at least want to make sure we get through this article today and perhaps into a couple of other things. Remember, he's talking about the ways that the bureaucracy in Washington with educational reform, specifically these Common Core standards, are really dancing very, very shrewdly around the law, yet are coming up with strategies to accomplish the very same things that they would be able to accomplish if there was no such federal legislation denying the federal government control over curriculum. That's his strategy, and he goes on with that by making specific reference to the Obama administration, which, of course, he's referring to the Education Department under the leadership of Arnie Duncan, who's the secretary. The Obama administration has purchased states' obedience by partially conditioning waivers from onerous federal regulations from No Child Left Behind and receipt of federal largesse, federal funds. $4.35 billion in Race to the Top money from the 2009 stimulus program on the state's embrace of the Common Core. In other words, many states and school systems within states were unable to meet the more rigid standards and demands of No Child Left Behind, which is the program that began during the Bush administration. And as we know, that program was driven more and more by accountability and standardized tests. And the idea was that if a particular school was not meeting standards, then it was included in a growing list of schools that were not making what was called AYP, annual yearly progress, towards the achieving of those specific goals. And consequently, the school was put on the watch list and given 3 years to get off this list. And if they didn't do it, if they didn't make the changes necessary, and the only way they could prove that they made them is by testing the kids, then after 3 years they were put on a permanent list and faced with the loss of federal funds, potentially the closing of jobs, the elimination of positions, and the threat that parents would be free to not go to that local school anymore, even though it's their district school. They would be given the freedom to send their children to other schools within the region that were meeting No Child Left Behind standards. And the fact of the matter is, this law went on, the No Child Left Behind legislation went on for better than 10 years. And what became very clear, and this is the story. This is what the records will show you, is that over the years, more and more school systems found themselves not making AYP, annual yearly progress. Some of them the best state schools in their states. The example that's most often used to make this point is Massachusetts. Massachusetts is known to have the toughest, most rigid standards of any state in the union in terms of its public education systems. In fact, the point is made that in many areas, the standards that Massachusetts establishes for its schools to meet are more rigid than the Common Core standards themselves. And yet by the time we got to 2010 and 2011, the majority of Massachusetts schools were on the endangered list for not making AYP. Consequently, when this started to happen, when even the best schools were finding it more and more difficult, those in Washington who were implementing the standards, who were enforcing them, began to grant more and more waivers to more and more school systems. I can remember here in West Virginia, for example, that the State Department of Education in West Virginia requested a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education on No Child Left Behind because so many of West Virginia schools weren't making the grade. The waiver was granted, but mainly because it was granted to so many other states that had, at least on the surface, more successful school systems than ours. And the fact of the matter is, in the intervening years, more and more of West Virginia's schools have found ways to get off that list. In other words, more and more of West Virginia schools are meeting standards of No Child Left Behind. What that means is more and more of our schools are teaching to those tests. And our kids are doing better on those tests. And if you want evidence of that, just interview our teachers. It doesn't matter whether they're elementary teachers, middle school teachers, or high school teachers. Just talk to them and they'll tell you that they are being required to spend less and less time on teaching curriculum and more time teaching to those tests. In the history grant that we just completed, Keith Lilly and I, this past summer, teachers in that program have been were telling us over the last 3 years that they are finding it almost impossible to teach history at all, because the time that is allotted to history, they are being forced to spend teaching reading and writing and teaching to those tests, standardized tests. And one of the solutions that we came up with in the grant is to encourage our teachers to use primary history sources as the content for the teaching of writing and reading skills that would be meeting the standardized tests. In other words, to find a way to make it work. But I've had teachers tell me straight up that I don't have time to teach the kind of history you've been promoting in this grant program. That in order to be fair to my students and to give them a chance on these tests, given what might happen to our school, to its budget, and all to jobs of people who work here and all the rest of it, I have no choice but to make sure that my kids perform on these standardized tests. And the result is that West Virginia, and I'm guessing other states as well, began to find a way to meet the standards and get off the watch list under No Child Left Behind. But the reality is more and more states and school systems were requesting waivers from the regulations of No Child Left Behind. And once that began to happen and it became obvious that No Child Left Behind was not working the way it was intended to work, then the officials in Washington, and specifically Arne Duncan, came up with a strategy during the first Obama administration, which is the program that we've called, for lack of a better term, Race to the Top, where the Federal Department of Education allocated $4.35 billion from the stimulus, which was the recovery from the recession, in order to make grants available to school systems, in order to infuse all of this revenue into their education systems. But, as George Will points out, and he's exactly right, the requirement was that in order to be eligible for Race to the Top dollars, the state had to buy into the Common Core standards. You had to agree to adopt them, even before they were written. Or you were ineligible for over $4 billion that was being made available. Also, if you requested a waiver to be excused from the regulations of No Child Left Behind, you would receive a waiver, but only on the stipulation that you adopt the Common Core. So the result is, by making No Child Left Behind waivers and Race to the Top dollars available only to states that adopted the Common Core, in almost a matter of no time at all, 45 states in the District of Columbia bought into the Common Core before they were even completed. So, to go back to George Will's point, and I think he's right, Washington is not establishing curriculum standards. It's not taking direct control over curriculum. But it's found ways to use federal money, largesse, and excusing school systems from rigid No Child Left Behind school regulations by making them contingent on adopting the Common Core. The Common Core has swept the nation. And only now that almost all the states in the Union have bought into this system are people beginning to seriously look at it and are beginning to question some of the ingredients and some of the specifics of it. So again, let's not lose sight of what we're talking about here. Let's not lose sight of Dr. John's call at the beginning of this hour. The fact that there seems to be something disingenuous about this, because rejecting the Common Core, attacking the Common Core without anything to replace it, basically says that your fallback position is the system that currently is. And the system that currently is only working for the few. Those that are going to the Ivy League schools and the rest of it. But let me be even more specific. One moment. I apologize for the interruption, but it was a mini crisis. I had my cat locked in the studio with me here, and he wanted to get out. And I figured he'd start to go up the curtains and everything else if I didn't get up and open the door and let him go. So I apologize for the interruption. I was at the point of making the point that there's something much more serious to this than falling back to the existing education system, which is working for the few, but not the many. And that is that schools are using the failures of public school systems to come up with more private alternatives to public education. We've always had private schools. We've had the Catholic school system, which is an incredible school system nationally. And we've had other religious denominations who have started their own schools as well. But we've also had what is usually referred to as the charter school movement. We have all of these private sector alternatives to public education, which increasingly has drawn some of the brightest students from the public system, leaving to our public school teachers classrooms that are filled proportionally with more and more students that are struggling, as the best students are finding a way to exit. The point that I'm making is that at the very beginning of his article, George Will makes the point that the Common Core movement is designed to advance in primary and secondary education the general progressive agenda of centralization and uniformity. I would suggest to you something equally as devastating. That the agenda of the right in attacking the Common Core is designed more than anything else to destroy public education in America by creating a situation which is going to draw more and more students out of the public system into these private alternatives. And for many of these, the data is beginning to come in and suggest that while many of them work, many of them don't. And many of these for-profit alternatives to public education have begun to show what they are really about, which is profit. What we're saying here is that it is very, very important that we make sure what it is we're talking about when we talk about Common Core or educational reform or whatever. It's very important to perceive, to think, and to recognize that many people who are being very vocal in the debate over the Common Core standards have an agenda which is not as obvious, but is clearly driving the criticisms that they make. And I think we need to recognize that. So what we're finding, as I do the reading more and more about the Common Core, what we're finding is that on the right, the attacks about the Common Core are often valid, but they are driven by an agenda which is bigger and more insidious. But on the other hand, attacks on the Common Core are coming from the left as well. And they are well-intentioned and very sincere because the standards don't appear ready to do anything to make it possible for students who have traditionally been not successful in public education to become successful. In other words, there's nothing in the standards that seems to be able to show promise of changing the status quo. So in a sense, what we end up doing almost is saying, No Child Left Behind said, this is an example from one of the pieces of literature that I read on this, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this. I'm not going to bother going and making the citation now, but this is not mine. But the example that is used, which I think is very effective, is what we're ending up with here a lot of times is a strategy which is kind of empty. And what I mean by that, it kind of says, No Child Left Behind set the bar at 5 feet. But what we found is that fewer and fewer of our kids can make it when the bar is set at 5 feet. So what we're doing now with the Common Core standards is raising the bar to 6 feet and telling our kids to jump higher. That's not possible. In effect, what that means is you're condemning more people to fail. Unless you do something to change the situation. So again, I think we really need to be aware of what's real and what only appears to be real here. But I think it's very significant. And George Will makes the point, and it is a valid one also. There's one major piece of this Common Core standards puzzle that we haven't addressed yet. And that's the role being played in the movement to adopt the Common Core by the nation's wealthiest few, the billionaires. Principally, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. But other Mayor of New York, Bloomberg, who just left office, and many others. I'll get to that in a moment. Back to George Will. Many proponents of the Common Core seem to deem it beneath their dignity to engage opponents' arguments. In other words, what Will is doing is complaining by saying the people who are pushing the Common Core aren't even giving us the courtesy to respond to our criticisms. Preferring, he says, to caricature opponents as political primitives and to dismiss them with flippancies, such as this from Bill Gates. Bill Gates made this comment. It's in much of the literature. It's pretty powerful. He says it's ludicrous to think that multiplication in Alabama and multiplication in New York are really different. So that's the way that George Will says that proponents of the Common Core are kind of being flip and they're blowing us off, is what George Will is saying with comments like that. Of course, he made the comment earlier in his article that Washington would never, ever prescribe curriculum. George Will goes on. What is ludicrous is Common Core proponents disdaining concerns related to this fact. 50 years of increasing Washington input into K-12 education has coincided with disappointing cognitive outputs from schools. It is eccentric that it is imprudent to apply to K-12 education the federal touch that has given us healthcare.gov. Zap, right at the very end. Talk about being flippant and dealing with your opponents with disdain. George Will returns to what I believe is his thesis toward the very end of his articles and points out that what we're seeing here in education is an effort to federalize public education the way that the Obama administration has taken over health care. And, of course, the implication of Will's whole point is it failed and this will fail. So, again, I repeat, it seems to me that Will's priority, more than the Common Core, is using criticism of the Common Core to attack the Obama administration and what it stands for. This is not educational discussion to George Will. It's political discussion. It's ideological discussion. The actors may change, but the play remains the same. And then he talks about, in spite of all of this, the growing opposition to the Common Core seems to demonstrate to him what are three very healthy aspects of today's politics. First, because new communication skills and technologies are enabling minorities to force topics into the political agenda that could never get there before. Before, the communication and technology Second, Will says, is the uprising of local communities against state capitals, the nation's capital, and various muscular organizations like the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, teachers' unions, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So, in other words, in spite of the fact that political power and big money is behind the Common Core, the fact of the matter is local school communities are finding a way to protest, finding ways to protest. And then again, he points out that despite all of this, opposition to the Common Core is surging because, and he concludes his article with one of the more poignant, sarcastic comments at all. His third point about what gives him hope is that opposition to the Common Core is surging because Washington, in trying to deal with opponents to it, is in effect saying, if you like your local control of education, you can keep it, period. Obviously, a reference to the president's comment about health care. If you like your current health care system, you can keep it. And he has since apologized for saying that. So what I'm saying in conclusion is that despite the fact that George Will's criticism of the Common Core has a lot of substantive, good, worthwhile, valuable information in it, the fact of the matter is he never varies from the political agenda which drives the article, namely his efforts to attack Washington, to attack the Obama administration, to attack the president's health care program, to attack the Department of Education, and all the rest of it. But again, none of this with an alternative, with any alternatives. None of this with an idea of let's sit down together, roll up our sleeves, let's look at some of the problems of the Common Core and see if we can fix them, because maybe what the Common Core is all about is needed. No mention, no reference to that possibility at all. Consequently, one must conclude, I conclude, that the real agenda here is to attack anything that threatens to alter the status quo, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's in the K through 12 school systems of America. And if that's true, then what you are doing is defending a healthcare system in which 50 million Americans are excluded, or what you are doing is attacking an education system which for 65 to 70% of the American population is working, in some cases, education system in which the few are succeeding and the many are not. I would suggest to you that it violates the basic premises with which the founders created this republic. It denies the reality of the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. This is me talking. These are my own comments. In my mind, it makes a mockery of the philosophy, an economic system for the founders' commitment to set up a society whose goal is equity for all and justice for all and favoritism toward none. If that's what's not happening, if that's what you're doing, is conducting or running an educational system in America that's denying real opportunity and a fair chance, justice, to the majority of American citizens, then if you are defending that system, you are inadvertently, by implication, defending the unfairness and inequality which that system produces. I would suggest to you that one of the things that's becoming very clear here is the differences of attitude toward the Common Core on the part of the Bill Gateses and Warren Buffetts and the rest of them, from those for whom George Will writes. And I think it is very, very significant. I think that the agenda that George Will is arguing for here is more important than what he says about the Common Core, although the content that he uses is very, very valuable and very, very helpful. In alternate, and I have to thank Gene, one of our listeners, for alerting me to this article, which is made available on alternate, and it is a liberal criticism of the Common Core. Yet the irony is that much of the information contained in it validates the information that George Will provides. The fact is there's absolutely no question that the federal government and the Federal Department of Education has maneuvered the situation and used the idea of waivers from regulations under No Child Left Behind and access to Race to the Top dollars of over $4 billion in order to coerce, and I guess that's an accurate word, in order to coerce states into adopting the Common Core, even though they didn't know what they were, by suggesting that if you don't adopt the Common Core, you can't apply for the dollars and you can't get your waiver to No Child Left Behind. So inadvertently, it amounts to what George Will would argue is a federal takeover of our education system, because it's very obvious that school systems and teachers in individual schools are going to have to make the adoption of resources and reading materials and all the rest of it conducive to the performance of students on the standardized test that demonstrates the effectiveness and the accountability of their classes within the schools that they teach, within the systems that manage those schools, within the states that manage the entire education system of that state. So what we're basically witnessing here is pretty much a takeover. There is absolutely no question. And so the article that I have in my hand, which we don't have time to go into today, we'll pick it up tomorrow, because we're now at 5 minutes before the hour. So we've got about 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes left in our program today. But let me suggest to you that the article's author is Stan Karp, and the title of the article is Something's Rotten About the Common Core. Core, Apple Core, rotten, etc. And it comes under the category of the program called Rethinking Schools. This was written, published on the 22nd of January, which is 4 or 5 days ago. And the introduction says that it is a revised version of a talk on the Common Core state standards delivered in Portland, Oregon on September 20th, 2013. The Common Core standards have been adopted by 46 states and are currently being implemented in school districts throughout the United States. And as an intro to this, which we'll get into tomorrow, let me say that the major criticism from the left is not a criticism that Common Core standards are necessary. It's the idea is that something needs to be done. But the fact of the matter is, the major criticism from the left is that there's nothing in the Common Core to suggest that anything's going to happen which is going to make it possible for more and more people to succeed in this education system. Consequently, what we're doing is the example that I used before. We're raising the bar from 5 feet to 6 feet, and we're telling kids to jump higher. But beyond that, we're really not doing anything to address the reasons that so many of our youngsters have not been able to make muster, to meet muster. In the face of school systems throughout the world, which are rapidly passing us, as more and more of their children are meeting these standards, these kinds of standards and goals or measures, if you will. We've got a major issue on our hands here. What I'd like to do tomorrow is address some of the basics of the liberal criticism of the Common Core standards. Return to what I think is an absolutely beautiful piece on the ingredients of the Common Core standards and where they came from. We covered a lot of that today. But some of the information that's associated with this, I think, will astound you. I think you'll find it unbelievably interesting and challenging. And then finally, step 3 is to actually look at the standards themselves and then draw some conclusions about what might be wrong with them, what might be right about them. And the fact of the matter is, and I guess this would be in the context of a conclusion for today's program, it's one thing to criticize the strategies used to get these Common Core standards adopted. It's one thing to attack those who have become the most prominent proponents of the Common Core. But the fact of the matter is, so far, we've seen nothing that even suggests that the Common Core standards aren't good things. And ought to be tweaked in order to be made effective. We're at 59 after the hour. We're at the end of our program today. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I want to thank John for his wonderful call. I want to ask all of you, we're in for some bitter cold weather this evening and tomorrow. Please be safe. Take care of yourself. We need you, especially the people that are regular listeners to the Head On Radio Network. We need you folks. Take care of yourself, and by all means, you'll be welcome here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. We are at the top of the hour. Good evening.